All right, so this is the second video to the course. Welcome. In this video, we're going to be asking the question, what is critical thinking? Hopefully, you have already answered that question for yourself or posted an answer that you think is a good answer in the first discussion forum. And now we're going to run through some other answers that are popular. And then I want you to go back and reconsider your answers in the discussion forum, and then we'll be able to move forward to the next step of this course, which is going to be to watch a movie, which is fun. In any case, in the previous video, we saw that critical thinking was something that almost everyone involved with higher education thinks is a big deal, right? So faculty think critical thinking is very important. Employers think critical thinking is very important. Administrators think critical thinking is very important. So I asked you what you thought critical thinking was. And generally I get a few kinds of common answers when I ask about critical thinking or reasoning or any of these related concepts. A lot of people will say it's critical thinking is problem solving or processing information. Sometimes people think of it, will use the phrase unbiased. That comes up a lot. Sometimes also unemotional thinking, although that doesn't actually come up as often as you would think. And sometimes people will talk about justifying beliefs or actions. And all of these are really great ideas, and they're definitely part of what's going on here. So what I want to do, except maybe unemotional thinking, what I want to do here is suggest some previous answers that will kind of bring all of these different ideas together. So the founder of the critical thinking movement is generally said to be the philosopher John Dewey, even though he didn't actually use the exact phrase. In a 1910 book called How We Think, he talked about reflective thinking, and he called it active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. And he says that this constitutes reflective thought. And already this is bringing in one important, many important aspects of critical thinking. Critical thinking is about belief. Critical thinking is a process that requires effort. It is, as he says, active, persistent, and careful. You don't just you aren't a critical thinker if you're going on instinct. You aren't a critical thinker if you're doing actually what just comes automatically. Well, you want critical thinking to come automatically to you, but it's always going to involve an effort. Critical thinking is an effortful activity. And it's about what Dewey calls the grounds that support a belief. That is, critical thinking is about evidence, reasons for belief. So this was sort of early on. It's over 100 years old now. In the 40s, the term critical thinking became the name for the thing that Dewey was trying to get at. And a guy named Edward Glasser sort of helped codify this and solidify the name. And so this is what he said critical thinking was. It is an attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subjects that come within one's range of experience. So it's an attitude, it's a tendency, but and like Dewey was saying, it's a tendency to be thoughtful. So you have to put an effort into something. It is knowledge of methods of logical inquiry and reasoning. That is, so in order to be a critical thinker, you have to understand something about reasoning and logic. You need to know what you're doing when you're thinking, considering evidence in a thoughtful way. And you have to have some skill in applying those methods. That's number 3. So critical thinking calls for a persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the evidence that supports it and the conclusions to which it tends. And that last part is a direct quote from John Dewey. Okay. More recently, critical thinking. Bob Ennis is a philosopher who has developed a lot of good ideas about critical thinking that I rely on a lot. He has a fairly general definition. He says it is reasonable, reflective thinking that is focused on deciding what to believe or what to do. So it's reflective, it's reasonable, and it's ultimately about belief and action. You are trying to justify these things. Kevin Posson has a good one. Critical thinking is the practice of requiring, assessing, and giving cogent reasons for one's beliefs, values, and actions. So this is interesting because Posson isn't so much thinking about dispositions or tendencies. He's more focused on the social aspect, but he's still emphasizing this business of giving reasons for your beliefs, assessing reasons for beliefs, assessing reasons for actions as well, right? And you also require them. So it's got that social aspect. If other people assert something or say they want to do something, you ask them, what is their justification? And you're willing to give justifications when called on to do so yourself, right? This emphasizes the social aspect of it, is giving and asking for justifications for your beliefs, values, and actions. Richard Paul and Linda Elder have a little consulting business that is popular in educational circles and very successful about critical thinking. And they define it this way. Critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards on them. So this one's unique and cool because it emphasizes the idea that you are of self-improvement, right? Critical thinking is in some ways a practice of self-improvement. It's self-improvement in your thought that comes from, again, understanding the structure of reasoning, forms of logic. This is something that was in the other definitions. And using the standards for good thinking to improve your thinking. The nice thing about this is that this emphasizes pretty specifically what we're going to talk about in a second, what we're calling metacognition, thinking about thinking. So we don't need to decide on a particular definition of critical thinking. All of these are good, and the ones that you suggested are good as well. I do want to sort of point us to a general family of answers. So this is from Robert Ennis again. He suggests that something called the epistemic views. He categorizes a bunch of views of critical thinking as epistemic. And these, the epistemic views of critical thinking are the ones that focus on forming true beliefs. So a good thing to note here is this funny first word, epistemic. This is a word that I like to emphasize in a lot of my courses. Is a bit of vocab that you should build and have in your your internal dictionary. Epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, what it is, and how to get it. And so what we're doing when we're doing critical thinking is a part of epistemology, right? So the epistemic view of critical thinking is all the definitions of critical thinking that emphasize the idea of justifying belief. So here is the way Ennis characterizes the epistemic views of critical thinking. According to the epistemic approach, which I believe best fits the everyday usage of the term critical thinking, the purpose of thinking critically is to find the truth, or to get a reasonable approximation thereof, to get it right, so to speak. So the idea here is that the epistemic approach boils down to being able to form true beliefs about whatever it is you're doing. All right, so a couple other bits of terminology surrounding critical thinking. I already mentioned metacognition. Actually, let's start with the term meta-reasoning. One of the things that we're going to be doing when we think critically is we're going to be reasoning, because we're trying to get at the truth, and reasoning is our mental tool for getting at the truth. But we are also going to be engaged in meta-reasoning. We are going to be applying the process of reasoning to itself, right? So we're going to be reasoning about reasoning. And this is a specific example of a more general thing that I already talked about when I talked about the definition of critical thinking from Richard Paul and Linda Elder. So this general phrase is metacognition, right? And so this is anytime you apply thought processes to thought processes, anytime you're thinking about thinking, you're engaged in metacognition. And one of the nifty things about the human brain is that it's actually constantly reflecting on itself. Metacognition is a natural background activity of your brain. Critical thinking is a natural activity of your brain. And we're just trying to get you to work that muscle more, to emphasize it more, to do it more and do it better. So metacognition is thinking about thinking, any kind of thinking. And then if you're specifically using reasoning and applying reasoning to reasoning, we call it meta-reasoning. And we don't need to get into any finer level of detail than that about these ideas. That just points us into the general direction of self-awareness and reasoning that's going to be important for what we're doing. All right, so when I teach critical thinking, I use a definition just to explain what the difference is between, for instance, this class and another class I teach called logic, which is related. So the way I define critical thinking, it's one of the epistemic views. It's the use of meta-reasoning to improve our reasoning in practical situations. And then sometimes this can also refer to both the process of improving our reasoning and the product of that self-improvement, that is, the ability to reason well. So the thing that I emphasize in this definition is that it's about practical situations. And that distinguishes it from what I cover in my logic class, which is theoretically oriented rather than practically oriented. Another important aspect of critical thinking is what we call content neutrality. And so this is true of both logic and critical thinking. All the studies that are related in this field, they're all content neutral. And what that means is that we set aside the content that people are arguing about and focus instead on the way people argue. I haven't actually introduced the term argument yet, so I'll just talk about reasoning. We ignore the content that you were reasoning about and focus on the way that you reason, right? So when we do critical thinking, we can be talking about anything, absolutely anything, because if you can think about it, you can think about it critically. A few kinds of things tend to come up a lot because they are natural areas for us to use our critical thinking in. We're sort of primed to be critical thinkers when it comes to it. And a big one is actually law. So we're going to be watching the movie 12 Angry Men for the first part of this course. And one reason for that is that when we think about courtrooms and juries, our culture has primed us naturally to think about being a good critical thinker. So it's a good context to use. But we can use other contexts. Critical thinking comes up in politics, science. Politics, science, and law are the three main ones I use. Actually, comes up a lot in sports when people argue about sports. But we won't be getting into that so much because I'm not that much of a sports guy. All right. So we are engaged in meta-reasoning. We're engaged in meta-reasoning for a practical purpose, to be better reasoners. And when we do this, we're going to need to think about several aspects of ourselves and what we do when we reason. And a key one going forward for a lot of what we're going to be doing, and this will be the focus of the next video, I think, is the idea of argument. When we reason, we present arguments. And what I mean by an argument is a set of statements where some statements provide evidence for other statements. Or the way we've been defining it here, it's a connected series of statements designed to convince an audience of another statement. One of the things that I emphasize is that reasoning always involves an audience. Even if you're just talking to yourself and you're being your own audience, there's always some kind of context that's going on. So argument involves statements that serve as evidence for an audience, even if that audience is just yourself, and then it leads you to a conclusion. So argument has traditionally been the focus of critical thinking courses, and it will be in this one as well. But I want to talk about three other things that also should be talked about more in critical thinking courses. One is cognitive biases. And this has been a rich subject for research in psychology recently. Our brains are full of natural biases. And so we can label these habits of reasoning. They're just ways our brains tend to work. And, our brains are shaped by evolution, and they're shaped by evolution pretty well. So most of our cognitive biases our habits of thinking are things that work most of the time. But nevertheless, they can become dysfunctional in very specific circumstances. And so unlike argument, cognitive biases aren't necessarily about belief. They can often be about background ideas that are operating extremely subconsciously and are just habits. Let me give you just one example here. The king of all cognitive biases, the mother of all cognitive biases, is what we call confirmation bias. Once we believe something, we naturally seek out further evidence that confirms what we already believe, and we screen out evidence that contradicts what we already believe. So this, confirmation bias is a kind of cognitive bias that tends us towards conservatism, essentially. It makes us stick with the beliefs that we currently have. We ignore evidence against it. We look for more evidence for it. And this actually serves a function most of the time, but you can see right away how it can become a problem. It can become dysfunctional if you've got false beliefs. Okay. The definitions of critical thinking that we looked at in the past, too, were also all about character traits. And so sometimes it's important to talk about what kind of personality, what kind of habits, what kind of dispositions you need to be a good reasoner. So we can label these critical thinking virtues using an old-fashioned term for a good character trait. A good character trait is a virtue. And we're going to talk about this somewhat when we talk about 12 Angry Men. We're going to be looking at the characters in this story and then talk about what makes some of them good reasoners or bad reasoners, what personality traits that they have that enable this. And then the last thing I want to emphasize, in addition to argument, another thing that should be brought up more in discussions of critical thinking is the process of dialogue. This is, again, something we're going to see a lot in 12 Angry Men because it's a dialogue. It's a conversation. Reasoning typically isn't a solo activity. You can reason on your own, but reasoning is actually evolved as a group activity. It's best done as a group activity. So, and that's what we want to emphasize. So we're going to talk about functional group processes and dysfunctional group processes when we talk about being a critical thinker. All right, the last bit I want to do is give you some ideas about the third item on this list, critical thinking virtues. And then we're going to use this to set up viewing the first scene of the movie, because we want to talk about which of the characters in the movie are likely to be good critical thinkers. So this is another list from Bob Ennis. And lots of people have come up with lists of virtues that are good for critical thinkers. Ennis calls his dispositions, but it's roughly the same thing. And I like Ennis's list, as is often the case with him, because he's concise and interested in developing conceptions that work for teaching, which is the context that we're in right now. So Ennis has three basic sets of critical thinking virtues. One is care that beliefs are true, their beliefs. So a critical thinker cares that their beliefs are true. At rock bottom, you want not just to win, but to get it right as far as possible, as best as you can, to have a conception of the universe that matches the way the universe actually is. So we're looking for, this is just part of epistemology, an epistemic conception of critical thinking. We're trying to develop true beliefs about the world. Another important thing is that when we're forming our beliefs, we need to be honest and clear in representing what we believe and what other people believe. We live in an age of disinformation, and so now more than ever, things in the second category are incredibly important. People are forever these days calling people madmen when they're not, misrepresenting their own ideas. I don't want to get into the details of contemporary scene in this video, but I think now more than ever, representing positions honestly and clearly is an important virtue. The last category is care about the dignity and worth of every person. We'll talk about this in a second. Critical thinking actually winds up being tied to ethics. But Ennis breaks these three ideas down farther, and so I want to talk about these. So when it comes to care that your beliefs are true, he's got four sub-ideas. You need to seek alternatives and be open to them. If you believe something, you need to be open to the alternative beliefs. Suppose, all right, I will talk about the contemporary scene because I'm going to talk about COVID. Suppose you believe that, yeah, COVID's dangerous, but it's not so dangerous that we need to shut down the schools or that I should wear a mask in public. You can believe that. I assume whatever beliefs you walk into this classroom with, that's where we're starting, right? But if you're going to be a critical thinker, you need to seek alternatives to what you currently believe and be open to them. Be willing to consider alternative hypotheses, explanations, conclusions, plans, sources. And all of this is a matter of fighting back against the thing that I mentioned when I was talking about confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. It's all a matter of fighting back against confirmation bias. Your natural tendency is going to be to avoid evidence that goes against what you already believe. I mean, Christ, who wants to be wrong? It sucks being wrong. So you have to fight against that and always be open to the fact that you might be wrong. Endorse a position to the extent that, but only to the extent that it is justified by the information that is available, right? It is wrong everywhere and always for anyone to believe something beyond the extent of the evidence. So critical thinking isn't just a matter of having a list of things you absolutely believe and a list of things that you absolutely don't believe. It involves having hypotheses, tentative beliefs, things that you might believe 60%. You need to be well informed. A critical thinker is always seeking new information. And you need to consider other people's points of view. So all of these come together under the idea of taking care that your beliefs are true. Since you're going to be considering alternate points of view, you need to represent your own views and other people's views honestly. Be clear about the intended meaning of what people say. Determine when you are interacting with someone else's claims, focus on a conclusion or a question, the main thing that they're looking at. This is actually going to be a key skill that we're going to start emphasizing right away in this course. And it comes under the general heading, identify the conclusion of this passage. But it helps us in conversation stay focused on whatever the specific issue that it is that we're trying to do, trying to resolve and not get distracted. So we need to be clear about people's meanings. We need to focus on the conclusions that they are asking us to draw. We need to seek reasons for those conclusions and offer them ourselves. We need to take into account the total situation. One thing that happens when critical thinking fails is that people tend to focus on just one idea or aspect of a situation. But really, you always need to be considering what we call the totality of the evidence. And you need to be aware of your own basic beliefs. Be aware of your own biases. You've got them, be aware of them. So all of this comes in representing other people's ideas and your own ideas clearly and honestly, with the ultimate goal of getting your beliefs right. Now, the third item's a little bit different. Care about the dignity and worth of every person. So this seems like it's more about ethics than critical thinking, but it turns out that the two are deeply linked. You need to discover and listen to other people's views and reasons. You need to take into account others' feelings and levels of understanding. You need to avoid intimidating and confusing others. You need to be concerned about other people's welfare. So Ennis says that this isn't on the list not so much because it's a part of critical thinking, but because it's necessary to ensure that critical thinking is used for good. So this is what he says. The disposition to care about the dignity and worth of every person is not required of critical thinking by definition, but in order to be humane. I call it a correlative disposition, by which I mean one that is not part of the disposition of critical thinking, is desirable for all critical thinkers to have, and the lack of which makes critical thinking less valuable, perhaps of no value at all, or perhaps even harmful. So what he's saying here is, he's included this in the definition of critical thinking, the list of critical thinking dispositions, rather, to make sure that critical thinking isn't used for evil. But I would go a step farther and say, and this comes out, I think, especially in A and B on this list, actually understanding the dignity and worth of people is necessary for communicating with them. And communicating with them, we've already seen, is a necessary part of critical thinking. In order to listen to someone, you have to listen empathically, because most of what's driving the meaning of what they're saying is not their reason, but their emotion. You need to understand their position in the world, right? So if reasoning is a group process, and it is, then care for the dignity and worth of every person is necessary for that group process to go properly. And this is, again, a thing that we're going to see in 12 Angry Men, where care about dignity and worth turns out to be important for the group to be able to do their reasoning correctly. All right, so next up, finish exercise 1. Go back. I had 2 other questions on that sheet or that discussion forum. Answer them. And have a discussion there. And then once you've done that, you'll get 100 points for that exercise. Okay. I've also created a character guide for 12 Angry Men. The movie we're going to be watching next is as 12 characters. And it's sometimes hard to keep track of them. So what I did is I got some pictures from Wikipedia and some characters, little bio snippets, and then I've got space in the on the sheet for you to take notes. You can do it digitally, or you can print it out, however you want to do it. And then I've got a link to the movie, which is free on archive.org. You can watch the whole movie in one setting. I recommend that. But the first thing that we're going to do actually is discuss the first scene of the movie. I've broken up the movie into scenes just based on Googling around and seeing how other people broke it up into scenes. People seem to think it has a 3-act structure, so I went with that. In any case, our next exercise, exercise 2, will be about the first scene of the movie, which is like the first 12 minutes. So you need to watch that, or you can watch the whole thing in one sitting. I watch it again and again and again, and teaching it has become an excuse for me to watch it a lot. But that's just the sort of nerd I am, and you're not required to be the sort of nerd I am. All right, great. Hopefully I'll see you in the discussion forums.